Hi, everyone. My name is John Knox, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to this panel on the Global Biodiversity Framework adopted in December by the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. I'd like to start by thanking the American Society of International Law and the European Society of International Law for organizing this panel. The goals of the Convention on Biological Diversity are the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of utilization of genetic resources. However, in the 30 years since the Convention's adoption, it has often failed to meet these goals. In 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, known as IPBES, released a global assessment report estimating that 1 million animal and plant species are currently threatened with extinction. It seems increasingly evident that we're in the early stages of the sixth major extinction event in the history of the Earth. The most recent, which occurred 65 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous era, eliminated the dinosaurs, apparently as a result of a meteorite hitting the planet. This time, human beings are effectively playing the role of the meteorite. And so the question is, can we change course in time to avoid catastrophe? The framework adopted in December 2022 has been hailed as a significant breakthrough in setting conservation priorities for the next decade and beyond. It has also provoked renewed debate on the relationship of international conservation to human rights, including in particular the rights of indigenous peoples who have often been violently dispossessed of their ancestral lands in the name of conservation. Today's panel will address how best the goals of the new framework can be realized and the challenges that can be expected to arise in their implementation. We are very fortunate to have a group of panelists who have a truly vast amount of knowledge about these issues. Honestly, too much knowledge to really fit into just 1 hour, but we'll do the best we can. The panel will proceed in a kind of question and answer format. I'll ask each of the panelists a question to get started, and then we'll proceed in the kind of discussion from there. I will leave time at the end for questions from the floor as well. If you have questions at any point during the discussion, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom screen to write your question, and then the panelists will be able to see it. I'm going to introduce all of the panelists at the beginning, and I'll do so in the reverse order in which I will ask them their first question. So I'll start with Elisa Morguera. Elisa is the professor of global environmental law at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, in the United Kingdom. And she's the director of the One Ocean Hub, a global interdisciplinary research collaboration of research institutions in the UK, as well as Africa, South Pacific, and the Caribbean, as well as UN agencies and other international partners. The One Ocean Hub is a pioneering research institution on human rights and the marine environment, with a view to better connecting marine and social sciences and the arts to support fair and inclusive decision-making for a healthy ocean where people and the planet can both flourish. Second, I'll introduce Joan Carling. Joan is the Global Director for Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, an organization that fights to protect people defending Indigenous rights. Among Joan's many accomplishments are that she served for 2 terms as the Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, and she's also served as a member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Joan is a member of the Kankanai people, an indigenous people based in the mountain province in the Cordillera Central Mountain Range on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. And in 2018, Joan had a number of distinctions. 2 in particular I'll mention. One is the Duterte regime labeled her as a terrorist for her work to end mining abuses that would harm the land and displace indigenous people. And later that year, she received the Champions of the Earth Lifetime Achievement Award from the UN Environment Program in recognition of her work as an environmentalist and a defender of human rights. Third, we'll hear from Worku Yifru, who's the senior legal advisor at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity and head of the Legal and Intergovernmental Affairs Unit. He was previously in charge of the Policy and Legislation Department of the Environmental Protection Agency of his native country, Ethiopia. And among other responsibilities there, he was the director of the Ethiopian Conservation Strategy Initiative. At the UN, he has served as the Secretary of the Compliance Committee under the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety for several years, and was also the Secretary of the Working Group that negotiated the Nagoya Kuala Lumpur Supplementary Protocol on Liability and Redress. Finally, I'll introduce Elaine Geyer-Aleli, who is the interim leader of the governance practice at WWF International, the major international conservation organization. Elaine has over 30 years of international experience and an interdisciplinary background in the environment, socioeconomic development, and governance. Prior to joining WWF, Elaine was the Mali country representative for the Carter Center's Global Development Initiative, and she actually started her career in the OECD Environment Directorate, working with OECD member governments on policies to promote sustainable consumption and production patterns. And Elaine is based in Nairobi, Kenya. Elaine, I'm going to start with you. So could you give us an overview of the biodiversity crisis that I just alluded to? I'll just mention that according to WWF's Living Planet Index, which you publish every year, there's been a 69% average decline in wildlife populations since 1970. That seems very bad. Is that as bad as it seems? Is there any good news you could point us to?
Hey, well, thank you, John, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Maybe first I can say just a few words for those who aren't familiar with the Living Planet Index. It's a global index that tracks average abundance of populations of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians around the world, and essentially gives us a snapshot of the overall health of ecosystems. Over the years, the data in the LPI has significantly expanded, but it's really important to note it doesn't track trends in insects, corals, plants, or fungi, so a whole big part of the natural world which is not captured by the LPI. However, what the index is already telling us broadly is that there is a very persistent and very dangerous decline in nature. As you said, John, almost 70% of wildlife populations monitored have declined in the last 50 years. And freshwater species have been hit the hardest, with an average decline of 83%. This is an alarming indicator of the condition of freshwater habitats. So this epoch has been named the Anthropocene for a reason. It's human behavior that has been the dominant influence on the climate and the environment. And there are 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss: intensive land and sea use, especially for food production; overexploitation of species such as overfishing; multiple types of pollution; the warming climate and severe weather; and invasive species. So it is bad news. It's bad for the non-human species with whom we share this planet and the places where they live. And it's bad news for people, because nature and the systems and resources it provides us are the foundations of our health and our economic and social well-being. That's true for each of us here, and it's even more so for people with a high direct dependence on natural resources. It is easy to feel quite overwhelmed and powerless as individuals in the face of these trends. There are big entrenched systems that have brought us to this point, and it's not simple to unpack and redirect those. But we do know it's the way we produce and consume things and the values by which we govern and spend that have created the nature and climate crises. And I would also add growing social inequality as another crisis. And so it's in our power to change those things. So there is positive movement. It's not all bad news, because with information comes action. Awareness is higher than ever. And we can look in the business community. The World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, for example, consistently ranks environment and climate risks as among the highest global risks we face. Young people are leading the way in many progressive movements for the environment, for social inclusion and social justice, while often breaking the silos between those issues through their own internal diversity. There have been great recent advances in developing tools for the finance sector to direct more money away from destructive activities and towards actions that restore nature. And some progressive business and technology champions are rethinking how to meet human needs and aspirations with a lower ecological footprint. There are also some great conservation success stories, including those where communities, indigenous peoples, are more strongly enabled to protect the lands and territories and waters or coastal areas that they've been stewards of for many, many generations. So the global and national governance frameworks are not as ambitious as we need, but they are important, setting important norms. I'd note the UN General Assembly recognition of the right to a healthy environment, which is fundamental, and which, John, you had such an important role in developing. And I think in the global biodiversity framework, where countries have committed to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, and critically, recognizing that in order to enable progress, we must take a rights-based and human rights-based approach is critically important. So there is forward movement, but we also know that 2022, for those of you that would have seen it, Global Sustainable Development Report showed that with only 7 years to go before the Sustainable Development Goals are up for achievement, we're actually going backwards and we're losing the progress that we've made in past years. So we definitely need to move much faster. We need much more ambition to use all these different levers we have to make the deep changes we need to get to a greener, more inclusive and just economy that would also bring us back in balance with nature. I'll stop there, John.
Okay, well, thank you, Elaine. That was great. That helps to kind of set the stage for what the challenges are. Worku, I'm going to ask you from your vantage point as a top official in the CBD Secretariat to take on the task of actually describing the global biodiversity framework. That's a big thing to ask you to do briefly, but do the best you can to explain to us what are the main elements of the global biodiversity framework and why did it take so long to negotiate? Was it mainly delayed as a result of the pandemic or were there other factors at play as well? And I'll just remind you to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for organizers for organizing this important event and inviting the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity to be represented. Indeed, the process of negotiating and adopting this global biodiversity framework has been very long. The negotiations or the preparations of the framework were launched after the decision was made by the governing body of the parties to the convention at their 14th meeting held in November 2018. And now the negotiations were concluded only in December last year, exactly 4 years after the launch. As you suggested, Professor Knox, certainly the main reason for this, taking the time to complete the negotiations and adopt this framework was the pandemic and the pandemic-related problems. If it was not for the pandemic, the negotiations were supposed to be completed by October 2020. But that didn't happen. The main elements, the GBF has 4 goals that are anticipated to be made by 2050 and 23 targets that are required to be achieved by 2030. I'm not going through all the targets, but just to highlight few of them that we think are few of the targets and the underlying principles, perhaps, that in certain cases, they become more important. So the world community has agreed to protect 30% of terrestrial areas, inland water areas and marine and coastal ecosystems, especially those that are considered to be important for biodiversity and ecosystem and for maintaining ecosystem functions and services through a well-managed protected areas. This is one of the main and big achievement or element of the GBF. The GBF not only strengthened the focus on the rights and contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities, as you at the beginning mentioned, including the rights of indigenous people over their traditional territories, but it also underlines the importance of the various world outlooks towards nature, including traditional knowledge systems. It recognized, perhaps for the first time, of such an international instrument level, the concept of Mother Nature has been recognized in guiding conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity and understanding the nature-human relationship. The framework also recognizes the role and requires governments to protect environmental defenders. The framework recognizes agroecology, which has been a controversial issue for many years, as one of the approaches in ensuring sustainability in agriculture, fisheries, and forestry sector. The framework implementation is required to follow human rights-based approach. There is a specific target on gender equality and a target that requires ensuring gender-responsive participation in decision-making and access to justice and information related to biodiversity are also part of this framework. There is a target to at least mobilize $200 billion funding by year 2030 from various sources to implement the national, what we call national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and which entails the raising or the flow of something like 20 billion per year by 2025 to developing countries and 30 billion per year by 2030. The GBF is accompanied by other important decisions. It's not only the framework, but the framework is a package that include other decisions as well. And it does so by establishing mechanisms for planning, monitoring, reporting, and review. It establishes a strategy for resource mobilization, where in fact it has been decided to establish a global biodiversity fund dedicated to the implementation, to support the implementation of this framework. And this is in addition to, or as a complement to the existing funding mechanisms. There's also a long-term capacity building agreed and development, capacity building and development framework agreed, and a mechanism to technical and scientific cooperation. And this is also a kind of a breakthrough, a multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources has also been agreed and is part of the package in the adoption of this, this framework. Overall, we think at the Secretariat, the framework as ambitious. Elena said it's not as ambitious, but of course, our standard of ambition, of course, differs from sector to sector. But we think it's ambitious, but with the tools and mechanisms established to support and enhance its implementation, as I just highlighted some of them, and also taking into account the cross-sectoral sustainable development goals that all governments of the world and the whole of society are engaged in implementing them currently. The GBF is expected to make a significant difference in shaping the future of biodiversity towards a better trajectory and taking humanity, we believe, on the path of living in harmony with nature by 2050, which is in fact the vision of the previous strategic plan, which is now being pursued in the context of this framework as well. Regarding the next steps, countries and communities should now put in place, they should move very fast in putting in place their national or local specific targets, mechanisms, and necessary resources, using policy, administrative, or legal instruments that enable them to implement or translate the GBF and the other auxiliary decisions in accordance with their national circumstances. First and foremost, they should revise without any delay their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, or look into which GBF targets are equivalent to national biodiversity targets in their current national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and continue implementing them or start implementing them. Resource mobilization and access to financial and technological resources should be expedited at different levels. The GEF, the Global Environment Facility, has already started setting up the new fund that I just mentioned for the GBF as per the request of the Conference of the Parties. One last item could be, as a matter of the next step, could be baselines, working on baselines, trends, and capacities, as well as indicators for assessing progress on each target need to be made available, and human, institutional, and financial capacities for monitoring progress using indicators need to be put in place. I will stop here.
Thank you very much. That was incredibly comprehensive and concise at the same time, which I think is a real challenge in this area. Joan, as you well know, one of the main criticisms of international conservation is that it has historically violated the rights of indigenous peoples by violently expelling them from their ancestral homes. Does the global biodiversity framework successfully incorporate human rights protections? And how concerned are you in particular about the 30 by 30 target?
Okay, thanks for that, John. Maybe just to be clear that indigenous peoples has been engaging in the CBD processes because of its serious implications to our rights and well-being. And as you've mentioned, millions were actually evicted in the past in the name of conservation. Now, if you look at the GBF, there are several mentions of indigenous peoples and the protection of our rights. As already mentioned by the earlier speaker, it's in the framework of the framework of the GBF, particularly in relation to the considerations, where it acknowledges the contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities and provides for the respect, promotion, and recognition and protection of indigenous peoples' rights enshrined in the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples and relevant national laws. So it provides that framework. It also makes reference to indigenous peoples in 5 of the targets, and these targets include 3, 5, 9, 13, 22, and 22 relating to the recognition of the rights to traditional territories, respecting customary use, respecting and protecting customary sustainable use, and entitlement to fair and equitable sharing, including genetic resources from digital sequence information, respect for traditional knowledge, facilitating appropriate access, enhancing roles of contributions, and also in relation to free, prior, and informed consent on the access of biodiversity in the territories of indigenous peoples. And there is also a clear provision on the access to justice and information related to biodiversity by indigenous peoples and local communities, respecting our cultures and our rights over our lands, territories, and resources, as well as the participation of indigenous women, girls, children, and youth, and persons with disabilities to ensure their full and effective participation and the full protection of environment, human rights defenders. So if you look at all these references, there is sufficient protection of indigenous people's rights in the GBF. However, my concerns in the GBF is that it also puts limits to these rights. One, as I mentioned, in the recognition of free, prior, and informed consent, that is only respected if national law provides for it. That's already a big challenge because only few countries recognize by law the requirement for free, prior, and informed consent on matters that affects us, including our biodiversity resources. Second is the caveat on that the implementation of the GBF is subject to priorities and specific circumstances at the national level. And this is a big challenge for indigenous peoples, because in the past it's always used this national priorities is always used to justify the grabbing of our resources. But this time it's to justify our eviction from our resources and our biodiversity. And this kind of approach, which we call the fortress approach, is still the dominant approach in national policies and regulations concerning conservation and protection or national parks, protection of national parks. So with the 93 countries with indigenous peoples, having majority of them having this fortress approach as the framework of national policies, and if that policy will not change when countries are now defining their targets for national conservation and national parks, you can already imagine the serious threats for millions of indigenous peoples to be displaced. So that is the concern that we still have. So what we're pushing is that there should be clear policy coherence and policy reform that should do away with the fortress approach and ensure that the rights of indigenous peoples will be at the actual center, or at the center of the strategies and plans for biodiversity protection. Because without that at the national level, we will again surely be sacrificed in the name of conservation.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Joan. That was very clear and persuasive. And I imagine we'll come back to those issues as well. Elisa, before we do that, or as we do that, I want to ask you a question about marine conservation in particular. Much of the popular attention to conservation in the media and in popular press generally is about fauna and flora on land. But you've done a lot of work with marine conservation. How does the global biodiversity framework address those challenges? And relatedly, could you say something about the recent conclusion of negotiations for a new treaty on marine biodiversity on the high seas beyond national jurisdiction, and how that might intersect with or apply to or overlap with the global biodiversity framework?
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity, John. And I'll try and come back to some of the points already made by the other panelists. I think in a nutshell, the global biodiversity framework raises the ambition of both conservation and restoration targets for marine areas. In the past, we had a 10% target by 2020, and now together terrestrial and marine make 30% target by 2030 for conservation. And then for restoration, we had a 15% target by 2020, and now instead we have again the 30% target together of marine and land. And we know that the marine areas where we have much more potential, and equally we've been lagging behind in terms of conservation compared to land. It's equally important that the global biodiversity framework has included those explicit considerations of human rights, because we are lagging behind in the marine environment and among marine specialists about understanding the relevance of conservation and sustainable use in the marine context for human rights. And so those clarifications that John mentioned around the protection of indigenous peoples' human rights, but also other communities. I think this is an area where the CBD had already made some achievements that have been recognized by international human rights bodies. But having that explicit recognition in the global biodiversity framework really sends a message to those areas, including marine conservation experts and environmental NGOs who may not have been as involved in the area of work of the convention before. I think equally other references to human rights, whether explicit or implicit, are really important. I mean, I wish the Global Biodiversity Framework had maybe used as explicit language with regards to the human rights of women and girls and children more generally, particularly as the UN Committee on the Rights of Children's Rights in November published a draft general comment where there is explicit reference to the interdependence of children's rights from biodiversity and ecosystem services and the ocean. But hopefully that's a parallel process that will imbue the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Equally, I think that there's been a lot of work that the CBD has done with the World Health Organization on the importance of biodiversity for all different dimensions of everyone's human right to health. And I'm really hoping that that will carry through across conservation and sustainable use, the understanding of in how many ways, which I think many of us have experienced during the global pandemic, we are immediately and more remotely dependent from healthy ecosystems. And finally, I guess that point around environmental human rights defenders, there's been growing but still not sufficient recognition of ocean defenders as environmental human rights defenders. And in that context, I mean, we have to understand that tension also between those who might be protesting against existing or future marine protected areas, if those are exclusionary or have not considered human rights implications, and how we need to change practices instead through that recognition of the values, the contributions, the knowledge systems, and the lived experience and living memory of indigenous peoples, but also women, children, other groups who have been negatively affected and that have been left out so far from marine conservation and sustainable use. There are some other good indications in the Global Biodiversity Framework about what we need to do in the marine context and do more, both in terms of aquaculture and fisheries, the relation between ocean and climate change, spatial planning. And I think marine spatial planning will really be an area where all these issues should come into play, and practices could really bring together both that higher environmental ambition, but also the understanding procedurally and substantively of the human rights-based approach. And with that understanding, which we often miss, of the land-ocean connection, how those are systems that speak to each other, affect each other. We see it very clearly with ocean plastics, but in fact, there's much more to it than that. And we need to really use that planning approach to connect the dots, including in terms of the necessary research. And we know that we know less about the ocean than we do about outer space, let alone terrestrial biodiversity. We're at the start of a young decade for ocean science, and those considerations about the science we need for realizing the Global Biodiversity Framework in a human rights-based approach should really inform those efforts and the direction of additional funding than those that has been already marshaled through the Global Biodiversity Framework. It's interesting that the Global Biodiversity Framework and also decisions adopted by the CBD COP were already eyeing the likely adoption of the agreement. I like to call it Ocean Life Agreement. I mean, high seas and deep seabed are both covered by the new treaty on marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And having read the treaty, I wasn't there at the closing of the negotiations, so I've been following that since my younger days as a PhD student. I think there's some really important considerations around a stronger, more transparent, more accountable international approach to the creation of marine protected areas and other areas in the high seas and potentially also in the deep seabed. While we don't have explicit human rights language, we have several provisions on public information and consultation at the national and international level. We have references to food security and other socioeconomic objectives and protection of culture, which do speak to human rights. And we have some references to at least indigenous peoples' human rights and other local communities. And I'm thinking about small-scale fishers and peasants under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, both in the preamble and as a principle. So I think that seeing that parallel movement is very significant. Maybe the last thing I might say quickly on the new agreement is also how important it is, and this is something I've been reflecting with my colleagues in deep sea ecology and also sociology, about the need for strategic environmental assessments in those areas beyond national jurisdiction to fill those basic knowledge gaps we have in the ocean, to consider alternatives, to bring in different knowledge systems, and really use this new agreement in an environmentally and ecologically sensible way. And that also contributes to address the equity gaps in current deep sea research. So I think there are some really important opportunities in the treaty. The new structure, international structure that will be created, will really provide, I think, an important and unprecedented forum to bring forward conservation in those areas of the ocean on which we depend intimately, and yet we don't know yet enough about how much we are dependent for our current survival and future on Earth. So I'm really hoping that the human rights community, the environmental community will engage with this in the very near future. Things are set up and the agreement is completely sealed to conclusion very shortly.
Lisa, when do you, can I just ask you a follow-up question about the timing of that? When is the agreement going to be like open for a signature or adoption? I'm not totally clear on that myself.
Yeah, so my understanding is that a date for the actual adoption of the treaty is to be announced shortly. So there were very last minute negotiations that went on for 2 days. I think the Secretariat is to announce yet when the agreement, a clean text of the agreement will be adopted. And that will then give us an indication of opening up for signature. So we have yet to hear as far as I know.
Okay, thank you. And I imagine some people might want to know you have by far the most interesting backdrop behind you, and it seems particularly appropriate in this context. Is that a whale? What's the picture?
It's a whale shark.
A whale shark, okay.
Yes, and it's by one of the hub researchers, who an artist and a sociology education expert. That's
great. Well, thank you all very much. That was a really tremendous overview and description and analysis all wrapped together of some of the major issues. And I hope that the listeners kind of appreciate that this is really only, I don't know, we're only starting to get into the issues. We could really talk about this for a long time. Again, feel free to post in the Q&A questions you'd like the panelists to address. I'm going to kind of pose a general one for anyone who might want to answer it, which is, I mean, the elephant in the room, so to speak, is that previous goals like this have met with almost complete failure. The Aichi targets that were adopted in 2010, kind of famously, none of them was completely met, and many of them were not even partially met. Is there any reason to think that the current set of targets is going to be more successful? Has anything fundamentally changed that we can hope will lead to better results, or are we really still, are we likely to be having a similar panel in 2030 talking about the next set of goals and how we hope that those will be met after these weren't? Anyone have any thoughts about that?
Maybe, yeah, or cover too.
Orku?
Yeah, I will try. This is a very important point and question to ask oneself, Professor Knox. It's indeed a fact that most of the Aichi targets were not met. But I would say, however, the trend of over the last decade or so shows a gradual move, towards less resource-intensive lifestyles, a gradual move towards sustainability-oriented business models, and as we said earlier, it was target 11 of the Aichi biodiversity target from the previous strategic plan, where we have, in fact, some significant progress being made. This is probably one of the only targets where we can say that the previous strategic plan has perhaps made a difference. If this protected areas related target 11 of the previous strategic plan was a success, I mean, by and large, then I would say that the designation, implementation, and expansion of networks of protected areas, of course, with the necessary protection of the rights of indigenous and local communities that may be impacted by doing so, is perhaps now we have it as even more in a more ambitious scale, which aims at protecting 30% of the terrestrial inland waters and marine and coastal areas by 2030. So this could perhaps be the best pathway to reduce the rate of biodiversity loss and to achieve sustainability in global efforts to preserve biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services. So I would say because of these elements, because of these new developments and some evidence that we have seen from this relative success of Target 11 and now with this inclusion of the 30 by 30 target in the new GBF, probably we can remain optimistic about the success. Not full success, obviously, but for some significant success of this new GBF. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Woku. Joan?
Yeah, I'm I'm trying to be optimistic in a way, because I think the situation already calls for it, right? With the climate crisis happening now, so there's an impetus to really push for biodiversity protection, and I think central to this, to the achievement of this, is transforming the implementation of the GPF at the national level in partnership with indigenous peoples, instead of looking at us as the source of problem, will be a turning point. That kind of behavioral change that can happen at the national level with the respect of indigenous peoples through partnership in the designation and systems of protected areas will be a big catalyst that will be decisive. That's one. And in part of this is also, of course, the big conservation organizations. There's a movement among big conservation organizations about adopting human rights based approach, and they have developed policies along this line. But that remains in rhetoric in many ways, because when you look at on the ground situation, it's not reflected. It's the way they work with. It's more like, okay, we'll give you a little grant here, a little grant there. It's not actual partnerships. It's not joint planning on how do we actually manage and conserve these resources using indigenous people's knowledge, using our own ways of conservation. It's not leading to that. So unless we also move from lip service to actual partnership that is really reciprocal and respectful, will be a big development. And I would dare that is more important than the finance. That is more important, because if we are still working in silos, we will not achieve the GBF. When we're so the GPF actually provides the framework and the opportunities, but if we don't act together at the national and local level, then we will miss this opportunity.
That does seem to me to be the great challenge here, right? I mean, Woku correctly identified the target from Aichi of 17% as being one of the few that was actually met. But of course, as Jonas is saying, it's easier to set those kinds of targets. It's easier to make those kinds of commitments than it is to actually implement them. So it's easier for states to say, here's a line on the map around a new national park or protected area. It's much easier for them to do that than it is for them actually to put the resources into ensuring that it actually works. And it's easier for conservation organizations and governments to make commitments to human rights, including in the GBF itself, than it is to actually do the hard work of implementing them. But just to emphasize, going forward, what Joan says has to be the answer, in the sense that the only real way to achieve these targets is in true partnership with Indigenous peoples. One of the heartening things I think about the last 15 or 20 years has been the sheer number of studies that now confirm something I think that common sense and history would already tell us, which is that Indigenous peoples and local communities actually have better results of conservation than governments working in opposition to Indigenous peoples have historically had. In other words, there are just any number of studies now that show better conservation outcomes for parks and other kinds of protected areas when they actually are led by, or at least in partnership with, Indigenous peoples than when they're not. So that's actually good news in the sense that we don't have to think of this as being an opposition. It's something that we have to make compromises in either the human rights of Indigenous peoples or the conservation goals in order to achieve both. It's actually the reverse. They're more like two blades of scissors, or I don't know if that's a great metaphor, but they have to be able to work together in order to be able to achieve the results we want. But it's much easier to say that than it is to actually make it happen. Elaine?
Yeah, no, just to come in from one of the largest conservation organizations. I mean, it's clear. It's and some of you may know, WWF has been on a journey over the last couple of years to really look at our processes to ensure that we have all the safeguards, but more than safeguards, other processes in order to start to look at conservation from a different angle. The team I lead has been building what we call inclusive conservation, and even that term is, who's including who, but it is more a process of reflecting about the why and about what is organizational culture, not just within WWF, but within the conservation sector, to build that understanding and to shift what is a very, traditionally a very natural science-based perspective that has been in the conservation sector. I think the good news is we do see many organizations on that same path, and for sure, it is difficult to apply in complex governance contexts where rights are not recognized, but we're having that conversation too. How do we help the progressive realization? What can we do in different governance contexts? So I think it is encouraging. It's definitely not easy. It won't be tomorrow that everything is, easy to implement together, but I do think there is a shift. And I would say too, in terms of, why maybe this GBF is stronger than in the past, I think in addition to this recognition that we need to be working in partnership through the recognition of rights, I think there was more political clout, more high level awareness of the nature crisis now. We had the Leaders Pledge for Nature, the High Ambition Coalition, lots of different groups, the largest CBD COP ever, not necessarily good for carbon, but including through business attendance. We've got very progressive business voices now coming forward. So I think this whole of society approach is kind of starting to take shape. And we have a clearer target, which is this halt and reverse nature loss. It can't be any clearer than that. So I think there are these elements that together mean we're on a more common path than we were in the past.
I've thought for some time that there's kind of a generational shift going on with respect to conservation, where I think the previous generation of conservation leaders are kind of giving way to a younger generation that is more comfortable with rights-based approaches generally. The problem is we just don't have much time left to make that shift. Elisa, what do you have? What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, well, I think change needs to happen on all levels. And I think every single effort is important to bring that change about. And sometimes we don't know when, what will tip the balance towards a new change. But I think maybe something just to complement what John said, and I think I very much have seen also in my limited experience how that approach, like genuine partnerships, learning from different knowledge systems, is really what moves us away from that false hope of quick fixes towards transformative change. You really experience change as you try and engage in those processes. And I guess what I want to offer in my position also as a researcher is that those changes at the level of governance are much harder to achieve unless we change the way we do science. At least we change the way in which we try and co-produce knowledge, so that then policymakers will receive a whole different evidence base that is co-produced, is enriched by different values, and we're already, like, the setting, I think, of research questions is what then leads to sometimes like the wrong assumptions and all those gaps in evidence that then lead to very difficult, if not policies that violate human rights. But equally, I think in terms of then treaties, bodies, those new institutions and approaches, the new Global Biodiversity Fund, we need to think about those places as places of iterative learning, and really having also in that case, not necessarily develop new treaties, but find ways in which we learn from the bottom up, but also we learn across different regimes. We have that learning and dialogue across the different communities of practices who are on a journey, as Elaine said, and share, the learning, maybe the missteps, so that others can, keep advancing at the same pace or even faster, that's what we need. And so I think that there's some elements, for instance, in the new treaty on marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction that promise some iterative learning and adjustment. I think the CBD, the way in which it is constructed, can allow for that as well. And I think that dialogue, keeping really an eye on the ground of what international human rights processes are doing in responding to their growing understanding of the triple environmental crisis, is really important for that mutual learning and improving on practices. Maybe one thing I forgot to mention earlier, there's this reference to the right to development in the Global Biodiversity Framework. And at the same time, the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is developing a new general comment on sustainable development. And there's still very little discussion of biodiversity, very little discussions of the ocean in that context. It's all quite focused on terrestrial biodiversity, where we have learned a lot and made the most mistakes. But also it's a big responsibility for different communities of practices to contribute and make sure we don't replicate those mistakes in the marine context. And we're very clear about maximizing learning in all the possible governance avenues that are available to us.
Just to build on that last point, you referred to the triple environmental crisis, which is normally understood to be climate, biodiversity, and pollution and toxics generally. Of the three, I've felt for a long time that biodiversity is treated as the least urgent in a way. Do you see that changing? I mean, do you see increasing urgency that matches the kind of urgency we're starting to see on climate? Not to say that we're doing enough on climate, but at least it receives a lot of attention. I'll just put it that way, that I don't think biodiversity receives in the same way. Is that changing, or is that just inherent in the nature of the problem of biodiversity, because so much of it happens at the local level, because so much of it is happening in ways that maybe aren't as obvious unless you're experiencing them directly, as of course many indigenous peoples and local communities do? Or am I being too gloomy about this? Are we seeing a turn in how people are starting to think about biodiversity? I'm happy to end on a hopeful note if anyone wants to provide one.
I can jump in. I do think, that uneven attention and understanding has been real, but I do think it's changing. But it's been slow to change. I think, it was just in 2021 that the two UN, the climate and biodiversity bodies, came together and said, actually, these things are so intricately linked. I do think we're going to see that, and more organizations are talking in that same way, and sometimes about the triple crisis as well. I think one of the difficulties has been it's difficult to communicate simply about the complexity of biodiversity and the gravity of biodiversity loss, We don't have an equivalent to 1.5 degrees as an objective in the climate area, although I do think the GBF landed well with halt and reverse nature loss. That's pretty much says the essential, and that should help build more public understanding, I think.
Elisa?
Yeah, I've also been wondering for a while if using more the medical evidence around the multiple dimensions of human health that are affected by biodiversity may be something that people can relate more personally to. Because even during the global pandemic, I think many had that shared experience, but weren't quite aware of which part biodiversity played in that. In fact, which parts in plural. So I think there's an opportunity there, but otherwise we might see that movement. I think I was surprised, very positive surprised about seeing the High Commissioner for Human Rights involved in the GBF negotiations. I think things are changing, but that case about biodiversity needs to be made. And even in the conversation with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, I think that there were colleagues were struggling with like just the little information that is available on biodiversity just strikes the right chords, I guess, compare maybe to climate change.
Joe?
Yeah, just to quickly add that there was a survey on Man on the Street asking about biodiversity, and there's really lack of understanding. So we need to do outreach to the general public in a way that they can, as mentioned, that people can relate, so that they feel the sense of urgency. For us, we live with it, right? So it's in our system, but we're also finding it difficult how to explain that to the wider public. So that's actually the challenge that we face, that we need to do effective communication on the gravity of the problem on biodiversity and a needed element to combat climate change. So if we also tie it to the issue of climate change and the need to protect the environment, then I think we can get more action.
I've wondered for some time whether the word biodiversity itself is in some ways a little distancing as opposed to just nature or the natural world. Worker? And again, remember the mute button.
I always forget this. Yeah, so the other speakers have said, I think the crisis, the current crisis and the pace of this crisis happening in the area of climate change itself is raising the awareness and the appreciation that humanity is fast approaching towards several environmental tipping points, which includes biodiversity loss. There is an understanding, a broad understanding that the drivers of biodiversity loss and climate change are more or less the same. Climate change is increasing, threatening nature and its contribution towards not only people, but also to solving climate change itself. So if biodiversity is not addressed, then one will not be able to address climate change issues. So that consciousness, that awareness is really increasingly developing. Therefore, biodiversity loss and climate change, will not be successfully resolved unless both are treated equal. So that equal treatment is probably now getting there, taking both biodiversity loss and climate change as equally major problems, and both need to be tackled together. But of course, the term biodiversity, this was my own question as well from several years ago, whether that is really the factor that kept some kind of a distance between conservers, biodiversity users, and the policy and the regulation that we have on biodiversity. But I think probably we are now past that time. Biodiversity is now becoming a common parlance, a common lexicon nowadays. I hear more journalists, more activists, etc., using biodiversity. But of course, for the first several years after 1992 or early 90s, definitely probably that has created a damping effect of what is this biodiversity in a state of trees, in a state of wild animals that humanity knows and feels related to. So, but now I think biodiversity and biodiversity loss and climate change are the twin, of course. We will not forget the triple one, the plastic, which has been also addressed. So I think there is a broader consciousness towards appreciating the interconnections between these problems.
Well, good. This is the kind of hopeful note I was hoping that people would provide. Elisa, do you want? And I saw you just posted a link to the WHO report. Do you want to just say a word about that?
Well, just very briefly to say, this is work that the CBD Secretariat and WHO have done to really show how, our mental health, our physical health are affected by biodiversity. But there's some examples that are very measurable, like how quickly we recuperate from a surgical operation if the hospital is near a biodiverse forest, as opposed to any green area or no area at all. And how not only transmissible diseases, but also hereditary diseases, onset diseases, how all of that is affected by biodiversity. And I think several aspects of human health, which now we're becoming of mental health, that we're becoming more and more aware, are also affected. And I think this, at least to me, usually brings home whenever I discuss biodiversity to colleagues who have not necessarily worked that much in the area, really makes the penny drop, so to say. So I think there's also an engagement with the medical community that can be pursued, both to raise awareness and also to get them on board on the biodiversity conservation and sustainable use causes and the human rights-based approach. So there's definitely an opportunity there, and a slightly maybe different approach to evidence and awareness raising that could be engaged with.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think there's this kind of disconnect in a way with nature that those of us who grow up in more urban environments need to be reminded that we still have. I mean, obviously, if you or an indigenous people or local community that's directly dependent on and immersed in nature all the time, and it doesn't even come up. But for many of us, there's this almost kind of fiction that we live apart from nature somehow. We go visit nature from time to time, or we wish it well from a distance. But of course, all of us are immersed in the natural world all of the time. It's just a question of how aware we are. And so when the natural world is in decline, as it is, or it's under stress because of our actions, of course it affects us directly. How could it not? We're a part of the world. I'm hopeful that the people who have been listening to this, I hope you learned something from all of this and been spurred to think more about it. I just want to thank the members of the panel, and again, the ASIL and ESIL for putting it on. I guess I'll close. I've been reminded while we were talking with a line from a musical based on the Peanuts cartoon strip called, I think it's You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. There's a moment in that musical where Charlie Brown is deciding whether or not to do his homework ahead of time. And he tells himself, well, I work best under pressure. And if I put this off another day, there'll be even more pressure. And I feel in some ways that's where we are now with biodiversity. I'm hopeful that we work best under pressure because we have definitely been procrastinating as a society our willingness to kind of come to grips with this crisis. The next 8 years until 2030, we'll see how well we work under pressure. And I'm hopeful that 8 years from now, whoever my successor is in moderating this kind of panel will not be asking these same questions about how we're going to address the even worse crisis we'll be facing then, but we'll be able to be actually pointing to turning the corner in the way that the participants in the panel have been describing to do. So again, thank you all very much for coming. And I want to again thank the panelists. You did a really stupendous job. And I wish you all the best. I hope I'll see some of you at the ASIL